They called him the glass fool of Harlan Creek. They said he had wasted $300 on a madman's dream. They said the first real blizzard would shatter his contraption into 1,000 pieces and leave him frozen dead in the wreckage. But on the morning of March 15th, 1878, when the snow finally stopped falling after 7 months of the cruelest winter Montana Territory had ever recorded, Elias Thorne walked out of his cabin wearing nothing but a cotton shirt. His woodpile still held 19 cords. His neighbors had burned through 60 each. 3 families had abandoned their claims entirely, fleeing south before Christmas. 2 men had died cutting timber in January storms, desperate to feed fires that devoured wood faster than they could harvest it. But Elias Thorne stood in the spring sunlight, alive and warm, his cabin untouched by frost damage, his food stores still half full, and his body carrying more weight than it had the previous autumn. The glass walls around his home caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the melting snow. The journey to that morning had begun 18 months earlier, in the autumn of 1876, when Elias first rode into Harlan Creek with nothing but a dead wife's memory, a chest full of books, and the peculiar knowledge that had made him an outcast everywhere he had ever lived. "You're building what around your cabin?" The question came from Marcus Aldridge, the man who owned the general store, the sawmill, and by most local estimation, the town of Harlan Creek itself. He stood on the porch of his establishment, arms crossed, watching Elias unload glass panes from a freight wagon. 6 other men had gathered to observe the spectacle. None of them offered to help. "A greenhouse," Elias said. He lifted another pane, careful to grip the wooden frame rather than the glass itself. 24 feet by 32 feet, 8 feet tall at the walls, 12 at the peak. "Greenhouse," Marcus repeated. He looked at the men around him, inviting them to share in his amusement. "For growing tomatoes?" "For growing warmth." The men laughed. Elias had expected them to laugh. He had heard that same laughter in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Kansas. He had learned to work through it. "Son," Marcus said, and he was perhaps 5 years older than Elias at most. "I've lived in this valley for 11 years. I've seen winters that killed cattle standing up. I've seen snowdrifts bury cabins to their chimneys. Glass won't survive the first hard freeze, let alone a real Montana winter." "This glass is a 1/4 inch thick," Elias said. He set down the pane and pulled a sample piece from his coat pocket. "German manufacture. Same type they use in the great conservatories of England. It flexes before it breaks." "Flexes?" Marcus took the sample, turned it over in his hands, then deliberately dropped it on the wooden porch. It bounced once, then shattered. The men laughed again, louder this time. Elias bent and picked up the largest fragment. "You dropped it on its edge. The panes are mounted in wooden frames with felt cushioning. They're designed to absorb impact across the entire surface, not concentrate it at a single point." "I'm trying to help you," Marcus said. "You seem like an educated man. Educated men don't usually last long out here, but I hate to see anyone throw away good money on foolishness. Build yourself a proper cabin, double walls, sod roof, good stone fireplace. That's what works in this country. I've already built my cabin. It's 12 feet by 16 feet, single wall construction, a small iron stove for heat. What you're describing would require timber I don't have access to and labor I can't afford." "Then you'll freeze." "No," Elias said. "I won't." He finished unloading the glass panes while the men watched. 47 panes in total, plus the 12 he had already transported in previous trips. The freight. Cost alone had consumed most of his savings. The glass itself had taken everything else. He had exactly $14 remaining to his name, enough for basic provisions through October if he was careful, and after that, he would need to find work or starve. But the greenhouse would change everything. He was certain of it. The theory was simple. Glass allowed sunlight to pass through, but trapped the heat that sunlight created. A structure made of glass would collect warmth during the day and hold it through the night. If he built that structure around his cabin, the cabin would sit in a permanent pocket of warmer air. The temperature difference wouldn't be dramatic, perhaps 20 or 25 degrees on a sunny day, but 25 degrees was the difference between frozen pipes and flowing water, between burning 6 logs and burning 2, between slow death and comfortable survival. Elias had first encountered the principle in a book about English orangeries, great glass, buildings where wealthy families grew citrus fruit through the British winter. He had written to a professor at Harvard, a man named Jameson, who had studied the phenomenon. Jameson had confirmed the theory and added calculations of his own. On a clear winter day, Jameson wrote, "A properly constructed glass enclosure could maintain interior temperatures 40 degrees warmer than the outside air using nothing but sunlight. No fuel required." 40 degrees. In a Montana winter where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, 40 degrees meant the difference between death and survival. Elias had bet everything on those numbers. His cabin sat on a south-facing slope above Harlan Creek, positioned to catch maximum sunlight through the winter months. He had chosen the location specifically, rejecting 3 other claims that offered better soil and easier water access. The slope faced directly into the southern sky. No trees blocked the winter sun. The ground was rocky, which meant difficult gardening but solid foundation work. He began construction the next morning. The first task was the foundation, a simple frame of squared timbers laid in a rectangle around the cabin, with exactly 4 feet of clearance on every side. The timbers were 6 inches thick and 12 inches wide, sunk into trenches filled with gravel for drainage. Elias worked alone, digging through rocky soil with a pickaxe and shovel, setting each timber by hand, checking levels with a spirit glass he had carried from Pennsylvania. On the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the ridge above his claim. Elias straightened from his work, wiping sweat from his face despite the cool October air. The rider sat motionless for a long moment, watching, then guided his horse down the slope toward the cabin. He was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of hard leanness that came from physical labor rather than deprivation. His clothes were worn but clean. His horse was a sturdy mountain, breed, well cared for. "You're the glass fool," the young man said. "I'm Elias Thorne. Tom Aldridge." He swung down from his saddle. "My father is Marcus Aldridge. I've met your father. He sent me to watch you make a fool of yourself." Tom walked to the foundation, studying the timber work. "He said it would be educational. He said I'd learn what happens when a man trusts books more than common sense." Elias drove his shovel into the dirt and leaned on the handle. "And what have you learned so far?" Tom ran his hand along the nearest timber. "You've got your corners square to within a 1/4 inch. Your timbers are level to the bubble. You've trenched your drainage at a 3-degree slope away from the structure." He looked up at Elias. "My father builds for function. He says level doesn't matter in a frontier building. He says good enough is good enough. Good enough freezes when the structure settles unevenly and gaps open in the walls." "I know." Tom straightened. "I told him that once. He hit me." Elias studied the young man more carefully. "You've worked construction." "I've watched construction. I've read about construction. I've never been allowed to build anything myself." Tom's jaw tightened. "My father says reading makes a man soft. He says I spend too much time with books. He says I need to learn the real way, his way, which means doing whatever he tells me and never asking why." "What does your mother say?" She died when I was 6. Childbirth. The baby died too. Tom said it flatly, without self-pity. My father raised me alone. He thinks he did a good job. He thinks I should be grateful. Elias recognized something in the young man's voice, a tone he had heard in his own voice once, years ago. The sound of a mind trapped in a place that couldn't hold it. I could use help with the framing, Elias said. The work would go faster with 2 men. I can't pay wages, but I can feed you dinner and teach you whatever you want to know. Tom looked back up the ridge, toward town, toward his father. He'd beat me for it. Then don't tell him. The young man stood motionless for a long moment. Then he tied his horse to a post and picked up a shovel. They worked together through the rest of October, Tom arriving each afternoon after his morning duties at the store and staying until dark. Elias taught him as they built. He explained how wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes, why joints needed to allow for movement without losing strength. He explained how glass conducted heat differently than wood, why the frame needed to hold the panes firmly enough to resist wind, but loosely enough to prevent cracking. He explained how the angle of sunlight changed through the seasons, why the greenhouse's roof pitch had to match the winter sun's trajectory to maximize heat collection. Tom absorbed everything. He asked questions that revealed a natural understanding of physical principles. He made connections between concepts faster than Elias expected. You should have been an engineer, Elias said one evening. They sat outside the cabin, eating stew, watching the sun set behind the western mountains. My father says engineers are fools who think they're smarter than nature. Does he also say that about the men who built the railroad he uses to ship his goods? The men who designed the sawmill that made his fortune? Tom was quiet for a moment. He doesn't think about it that way. He thinks the world just has things in it, machines and buildings and roads, and they've always been there. He doesn't think about who made them or how. That's a common blindness. What made you different? Elias set down his bowl. The question deserved an honest answer. My wife, he said. Her name was Catherine. She was a teacher at a women's academy in Philadelphia. She believed that understanding how things worked was the greatest gift a person could possess. She believed that knowledge was freedom, that a man or woman who understood principles could never truly be enslaved by circumstance. He paused, remembering. She died of tuberculosis 3 years ago. I buried her in a cemetery in Pennsylvania, and then I started walking west. I wanted to find a place where I could live the way she taught me to think, a place where knowledge mattered more than tradition. Have you found it? I'm building it. Elias gestured at the half-finished frame around his cabin. Every measurement I make, every joint I cut, every pane of glass I set proves that understanding works better than guessing. If this greenhouse performs the way the principles say it should, I'll have proved something, not just to your father or the men in town, but to myself. I'll have proved that Catherine was right. Tom nodded slowly. And if it fails? Then I'll freeze to death, and your father will tell everyone he was right all along, and nothing will change. Elias smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's the wager. That's always the wager. November brought the first snow and the first real test of the construction. Elias and Tom had completed the wall framing, vertical posts of thick pine with horizontal cross members creating a grid of rectangular openings for the glass panes. The structure was skeletal, not yet windproof, but it already demonstrated the basic principle. On sunny mornings, the air inside the frame measured 8 to 10 degrees warmer than the outside air, even without glass installed. How is that possible? Tom asked. He held the thermometer, checking the reading for the 3rd time. There's no roof. The walls are just frames. The heat should escape. Some of it does escape, but the frame itself blocks wind, which is the primary mechanism of heat loss, and the frame absorbs sunlight and radiates warmth. Even an incomplete structure creates a microclimate. What's a microclimate? A small area where the weather conditions differ from the surrounding region. A south-facing wall creates a microclimate. A sheltered valley creates a microclimate. Any obstruction that changes how sun and wind interact with a space creates local conditions different from the general environment. Tom looked at the cabin, at the frame surrounding it, at the slope falling away toward the creek. So you didn't just build a greenhouse, you built a microclimate inside a microclimate. Elias felt a surge of genuine pleasure. Yes, the slope gives me southern exposure and wind protection. The greenhouse will amplify those advantages. Multiple layers of beneficial conditions, each one adding to the others. That's brilliant. It's not my idea. It's just applied understanding of principles that have been known for centuries. The Romans built heated greenhouses 2,000 years ago. The English perfected glass conservatories 300 years ago. I'm just combining existing knowledge in a new configuration. But nobody else here is doing it. Nobody else here has read the books. They began installing glass panes the next day. The work was slow and precise. Each pane had to be set into its frame, cushioned with felt strips, secured with wooden stops, and sealed at the edges with a mixture of linseed oil and lead paste. The sealant would harden over several days, creating a weatherproof bond that allowed slight movement without breaking the seal. Elias had practiced the technique on a small test frame before attempting the full installation. The mixture had to be exactly right, thick enough to fill gaps, but thin enough to work into corners. Too little sealant left cracks for wind to penetrate. Too much prevented proper drainage and led to rot in the wooden frames. Marcus Aldridge visited on the 4th day of glass installation. He rode up the slope alone, dismounted, and walked around the half-glazed structure without speaking. Elias continued working. Tom had hidden in the cabin at the first sight of his father's horse. 47 panes, Marcus said finally. At $3 each, that's $141, plus freight from St. Louis, another 60 or 70, plus the lumber for framing, the hardware, the sealant. He shook his head. You've sunk more than $300 into this folly. 314, Elias said. He pressed sealant into the edge of a pane, smoothing it with a wooden paddle. Plus 7 months of labor. For what? A glass box that the first hailstorm will destroy? The panes are angled at 32 degrees from vertical. Hail strikes at a glancing blow rather than direct impact. The angle also matches the winter sun's trajectory at this latitude, maximizing heat collection between November and March. Listen to yourself. Angles and trajectories. This isn't a battlefield, it's weather. You can't calculate your way past weather. Elias finished sealing the pane and stepped back to check his work. The British calculated their way to growing pineapples in Scotland. The Dutch calculated their way to heating entire villages with single furnaces and buried pipes. Calculation works, Mr. Aldridge. The men who built your sawmill used calculations to determine blade angles and drive ratios. Without those calculations, your mill wouldn't cut a single board. Marcus's face darkened. Those are machines. Machines are different. How? They just are. Machines are built by men. Weather comes from God. And God built the sun to follow predictable paths across the sky. He built glass to transmit light while blocking wind. He built air to retain heat when enclosed. I'm not fighting God, Mr. Aldridge. I'm using the tools he provided. Marcus stared at him for a long moment. His expression shifted through several emotions, anger giving way to confusion, and then something harder to name. You really believe you're smarter than everyone who's lived in this valley for the past 20 years. I believe I've read books they haven't read. That's not the same as being smarter. It is to them. Marcus mounted his horse. When this fails, don't come to me for help. Don't come to town looking for charity. You've made your choice. Live with the consequences. He rode away without looking back. Tom emerged from the cabin after the hoofbeats faded. His face was pale. He saw my horse. He'll know I was here. Will he hurt you? Probably. Tom picked up a pane of glass, held it up to the light. But I've been hurt before. It stops eventually. He carried the pane to the next opening in the frame. Show me how to do the sealant. I want to learn. They finished the glazing by the last week of November. The structure was complete, a rectangular building of glass and wood enclosing the small cabin like a transparent shell. The glass walls rose 8 feet from the foundation. The roof peaked at 12 feet, angled to shed snow while capturing maximum sunlight. A single door on the south side allowed entry. Small vents along the roof ridge could be opened for air circulation in warmer weather. Elias had installed a thermometer inside the greenhouse and another outside. On the morning after completion, with snow falling and temperatures at 14 degrees below zero, the interior reading showed 22 degrees above zero, a difference of 36 degrees. Tom arrived that afternoon with a bruised face and a split lip. He knows, Tom said. He went through my things, found the drawings I had made of your construction. Elias led him inside the greenhouse, then inside the cabin. The small stove held a low fire, barely more than coals. The cabin interior was warm, comfortable, perhaps 50 degrees. Sit down, I'll make coffee. He said I was a traitor. He said I was helping a fool destroy the family name. Tom touched his lip, wincing. He said if I came here again, he'd disown me. Elias poured water into the coffee pot and set it on the stove. What do you want? To do? I don't know. He's my father. That's a fact, not an answer. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Steam began to rise from the pot. I want to stay here. I want to help you through the winter, see if this works. I want to learn everything you can teach me. He looked up, meeting Elias's eyes. But I can't abandon him. He's difficult, and he's wrong about most things, but he raised me. He fed me and clothed me and kept me alive when my mother died. I owe him something for that. You owe him gratitude. You don't owe him obedience. He doesn't see a difference. Elias poured the coffee, handed Tom a cup. Then you'll have to show him one. December came hard and fast, temperatures dropping to 30 below zero for days at a stretch. Snow piled against the greenhouse walls, drifting to 4 feet on the north side. Elias cleared it each morning, shoveling paths around the structure, knocking accumulation from the glass roof with a long wooden pole. Inside the greenhouse, the temperature never dropped below 15 degrees above zero. Inside the cabin, with a small fire in the stove, it stayed near 60. Tom visited when he could, always with new bruises, always with stories of his father's wrath. Marcus had forbidden the townspeople from selling provisions to Elias. He had spread rumors that the greenhouse was cursed, that Elias practiced some kind of Eastern witchcraft. He had predicted publicly that the structure would collapse before Christmas. Christmas came. The structure held. Elias began keeping detailed records. Each morning he recorded exterior temperature, interior greenhouse temperature, interior cabin temperature, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, and snowfall. Each evening he recorded fuel consumption, counting the logs he burned and noting their approximate size. The numbers told a story that surprised even him. On a cloudy day with exterior temperatures at 20 below zero, the greenhouse interior stayed at 10 above zero. Inor are difference of 30 degrees. The cabin, with a small fire, stayed at 55 degrees. He burned 4 logs. On a sunny day with the same exterior temperature, the greenhouse interior climbed to 35 above zero, a difference of 55 degrees. The cabin, with no fire at all, stayed at 60 degrees from solar gain alone. He burned nothing. On average, accounting for weather variations, he was using about 70% less firewood than a conventional cabin would require. His initial supply of 25 cords, enough for a normal winter in this climate, would last him through this winter and most of the next. He wrote to Professor Jameson at Harvard, describing his results. He included sketches of the construction, measurements of the temperature differentials, and calculations of fuel savings. He asked if Jameson knew of any similar experiments, any other settlers who had attempted glass enclosures in cold climates. The reply came in February, delivered by a mail carrier who charged triple rates for the dangerous winter journey. Jameson was excited. He had shown Elias's letter to colleagues at the university. They wanted to publish the results in a scientific journal. They wanted more data, more measurements, more detailed construction specifications. One professor, a man named Whitfield who specialized in thermodynamics, had calculated that a properly designed glass enclosure could reduce heating fuel requirements by as much as 80% in suitable climates. 80%. Elias read the letter 3 times. His observed 70% reduction was close to the theoretical maximum. His design was working almost as well as physics said it should. He showed the letter to Tom. They want to publish this? In a real journal? In the American Journal of Applied Science, Professor Jameson says it would be the first documented case of residential glass enclosure in a cold climate. Tom sat back, shaking his head. My father said you were a fool. He said no educated man would take you seriously. Your father was wrong. I know. Tom smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the smile reached his eyes. I've known for months, but this proves it. This proves it in a way he can't deny. But Elias knew better. Men like Marcus Aldridge didn't change their minds based on evidence. They changed their minds based on consequences, and only when those consequences became impossible to ignore. The consequences arrived in late February, 3 weeks before the spring thaw. A knock came on the greenhouse door at midnight. Elias rose from his bed, pulled on a coat, and found a woman standing in the snow. She was shaking, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were hollow. Please, she said, my children, they're dying. Her name was Sarah Brennan. Her husband Joseph had died in January, crushed by a falling tree while cutting firewood in a storm. She had 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 9. They had burned through their entire wood supply by early February. Since then, they had been burning furniture, then barn wood, then fence posts. Now they had nothing left. Elias brought her inside, fed her hot soup, wrapped her in blankets. She told him the full story in broken sentences, pausing to cry, pausing to apologize for crying. Joseph had been a good man, but not a careful one. He had cut just enough wood for a normal winter. This winter was not normal. By Christmas, they were running low. By January, they were desperate. Joseph had gone out in the storm against her begging, determined to cut enough to see them through. The tree had kicked back when he fooled it. The trunk had caught him across the chest. She had found his body an hour later, half buried in snow. Since then, she had done everything alone, cutting wood with arms too weak for the axe, rationing food until the children stopped asking for more, watching the woodpile shrink day by day, knowing the cold would take them before spring arrived. I went to Mr. Aldridge, she said. I begged him for credit, for anything. He said he couldn't help. He said his supplies were committed to paying customers. He said I should have planned better. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. He turned you away? He turned everyone away. The Hendersons, the McCarthys, the old widow Patterson, anyone who couldn't pay cash. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. He has wood stacked behind his store, cords and cords of it. But he won't sell on credit. He says it's business. It's murder. Sarah looked at him with desperate hope. Please, I heard you have wood. I heard your cabin stays warm. I'll pay you in spring when I can sell the farm. I'll pay you anything. Elias stood. Get your children. Bring them here tonight. All of you will stay until the winter breaks. I can't impose. It's not an imposition. It's what neighbors do. He opened the door, gestured toward the cabin. The greenhouse keeps us warm. The cabin has room. I have food enough and wood enough, and no reason to let children freeze while I have both. Sarah began crying again, but this time the tears were different. Tom helped them move. He arrived at first light with a borrowed wagon, having heard the news from a freighter passing through town. Together, he and Elias loaded the Brennan family's essential possessions and transported them to the greenhouse. The children stared at the glass walls with wide eyes. The eldest, a girl named Emma, touched a pane and pulled her hand back in wonder. It's warm, she said. Why is it warm? Elias crouched to her level. Because the sun heats the air inside, and the glass keeps the heat from escaping. It's like a blanket made of light. But there's no fire. There doesn't need to be. The sun is the fire. We just have to catch it. Emma considered this. My daddy said you were crazy. He said only a crazy man would build a glass house. Your daddy wasn't wrong to doubt. It's good to doubt new things, but sometimes the new things turn out to be true anyway. The girl nodded solemnly. I'm glad you're not crazy. So am I. Word spread through the valley. The glass fool had taken in the Brennan family. The glass fool had wood to spare. The glass fool was living comfortably while half the town burned their beds to stay alive. Other families came. The Hendersons, a young couple with an infant, arrived 3 days after the Brennans. The McCarthys, 5 children and 2 parents stuffed into a cabin meant for 3, came the day after that. The widow Patterson, 70 years old and too proud to ask for help until her fingers turned black from frostbite, had to be carried on a travois by Tom. Elias took them all. The greenhouse was not large, but it was warm. He set up the cabin as sleeping quarters for the women and children, with the men rotating through shorter shifts. The greenhouse itself, heated by sunlight the day stayed warm enough for comfortable occupancy around the clock. People slept on pallets between the cabin wall and the glass, wrapped in blankets, warmer than they had been in their own homes. The firewood held. Elias had calculated for a single occupant burning a small fire. With multiple families sharing the space, sharing body heat, sharing cooking fires, the per-person consumption dropped even further. His original supply would last. Marcus Aldridge did not come, but he watched. Tom reported that his father stood on the ridge above the claim each evening, staring down at the greenhouse glowing with lamplight, at the smoke rising from the cabin chimney, at the evidence of survival that contradicted everything he had predicted. He's afraid, Tom said. I've never seen him afraid before. What does he have to fear? Being wrong. He's built his whole life on being right. Right about business, right about building, right about how things work. If he's wrong about you, he might be wrong about everything. He is wrong about everything. I know, but he's my father. Tom's voice cracked. I don't want him to suffer. I just want him to see. March brought the beginning of the thaw. Temperatures climbed above freezing for the first time since November. Snow began to melt. Creeks swelled with runoff. The worst of the winter was over. The families began to leave, returning to their claims to assess the damage and begin repairs. Each one stopped at the greenhouse door to thank Elias. Each one promised to repay him somehow. He asked for nothing. He had proven what he needed to prove. The greenhouse worked. The principle was sound. Knowledge had triumphed over tradition, but the final test was not yet complete. On the morning of March 15th, Elias walked outside to find Marcus Aldridge standing in the muddy snow, staring at the glass walls, his face unreadable. 19 chords, Marcus said. I'm sorry? You started with 25. You have 19 left. I counted through the glass. Marcus finally looked at Elias. His eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept. I started with 62. I have 6 remaining. I burned 56 chords this winter. You burned 6. The greenhouse. I know what the greenhouse did. Everyone knows what the greenhouse did. Marcus's voice broke. I almost killed them. The Brennans, the Hendersons, the McCarthys. I had wood stacked behind my store while they froze. I could have helped them, but I didn't. Because I was right and you were wrong, and giving them wood would have meant admitting I was wrong. Elias said nothing. My son hasn't spoken to me in 3 weeks. He moved out of our house. He's staying with the Hendersons now, helping them rebuild. He told me he's ashamed to carry my name. Marcus's face crumpled. He's the only family I have left, and I drove him away because I couldn't admit that a man with books knew something I didn't. The silence stretched between them. Somewhere, in the distance, a bird sang, the first Elias had heard since autumn. What do you want from me, Mr. Aldridge? Marcus took a shaky breath. I want you to teach me. I want to understand how this works. I want to build greenhouses for everyone in this valley so no one ever has to choose between freezing and begging again. He paused. And I want you to tell my son that I'm sorry, that I was wrong, that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the father he deserves. Elias looked at the greenhouse, at the glass walls catching the morning light, at the cabin where his wife's dream had finally become real. Come inside, he said. I'll put on coffee. We have a lot to discuss. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Elias had learned to make it during his years of wandering. Marcus Aldridge sat across from him at the small table inside the cabin, his hands wrapped around the tin cup, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the dark liquid. Start from the beginning, Marcus said. I want to understand everything. Elias pulled a worn notebook from the shelf above his bed. The pages were filled with sketches, calculations, and observations dating back to his time in Pennsylvania. He opened to a diagram of a glass pane with arrows indicating light transmission and heat retention. Glass is transparent to visible light, but opaque to thermal radiation. When sunlight passes through a pane, it carries energy. That energy strikes surfaces inside the enclosure, walls, floors, objects, and converts to heat. The heat tries to escape, but glass blocks it. The energy comes in, but cannot get out. This is why a closed carriage feels warm on a sunny day, even in winter. I've noticed that, never thought about why. Most people don't. They experience the world without asking questions about mechanisms. Elias turned to another page, showing a cross-section of the greenhouse design. The principal scales. A small glass box gets warm. A large glass building gets warmer. An entire structure surrounding another structure creates layers of trapped heat, each layer adding to the retention. Marcus studied the diagram. The cabin sits inside the greenhouse, so the cabin benefits from the warmth the greenhouse collects. Exactly. And the greenhouse benefits from the heat the cabin releases. It becomes a system, each element supporting the others. On a sunny day, the cabin needs no fire at all. The solar gain through the glass walls provides enough warmth to maintain comfortable temperatures. But what about cloudy days? What about storms? Elias turned to his records. On the cloudiest days this winter, with exterior temperatures at 25 below zero, the greenhouse interior stayed at 5 above zero, a difference of 30 degrees with no sunlight at all. The glass walls block wind, which is the primary mechanism of heat loss in conventional structures. Even without solar gain, the wind protection alone reduces fuel requirements by roughly 40%. Marcus shook his head slowly. 40%. Do you know how many lives that would have saved this winter? How many families wouldn't have burned their furniture, their barns, their fences? I know. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you try to convince us before the winter hit? Elias closed the notebook. I tried. You laughed at me. You dropped a piece of glass on your porch and told everyone I was a fool. What else could I have done? Marcus had no answer to that. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon. Elias explained the importance of southern exposure, the calculations for roof pitch based on latitude, the specifications for glass thickness, and frame construction. He showed Marcus the sealant mixture, demonstrating the proper consistency and application technique. He walked him through the foundation requirements, the drainage considerations, the ventilation systems needed to prevent overheating on warm spring days. Marcus listened. He asked questions. He took notes in a small ledger he had brought from the store. By evening, Tom had arrived. He stood in the doorway of the greenhouse, staring at his father sitting at Elias's table, clearly uncertain whether to enter. Tom, Marcus said. He stood, his voice rough. I need to tell you something. I don't want to hear it. I know, but I need to say it anyway. Marcus walked toward his son, stopping an arm's length away. I was wrong. About Elias, about his greenhouse, about everything. I was so afraid of being proven foolish that I nearly let people die. I let my pride matter more than their lives. Tom's jaw tightened. You let children freeze while you hoarded wood. Yes, I did, and I will carry that shame until the day I die. Marcus's voice cracked. But I'm asking you to let me try to make it right. Not to forgive me, not yet, maybe not ever, just to let me try. The silence stretched. Outside, the evening wind rattled the glass panes. Gently, a sound like distant bells. What do you want to do? Tom asked finally. I want to build greenhouses for everyone who needs one. I want to use my sawmill, my store, my resources to make sure no family in this valley ever faces another winter like this one. Marcus looked back at Elias. If Mr. Thorne will teach me how? Tom turned to Elias. Will you? Elias considered the question. He thought about Catherine, about her belief that knowledge was freedom. He thought about the families who had sheltered in his greenhouse, the children who had survived because of principles discovered by men in distant universities. He thought about the letter from Professor Jameson, the promise of publication, the possibility that his work might spread beyond this single valley to help countless others. I'll do more than teach you, he said. I'll help you build the first one. We'll start with the Brennan claim. Sarah's children deserve a warm home. The construction began in April, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. Elias, Tom, and Marcus worked together, an unlikely crew united by shared purpose. Other men from the valley joined them, families who had survived the winter through mutual aid and were now eager to contribute. The Brennan greenhouse was smaller than Elias's design, 16 feet by 20 feet, enclosing a cabin that measured 10 feet by 12. The reduced scale meant fewer materials and lower costs, but the principle remained the same. Glass walls, angled roof, southern exposure, proper drainage. Sarah watched the construction with tears in her eyes. Joseph always wanted to build something lasting, she said. Something that would matter. He never got the chance. This will last, Elias told her. This will matter, and your children will grow up warm because of it. They completed the structure in 3 weeks. The first night the family spent inside, temperatures dropped to 30 degrees, a late spring cold snap that caught everyone by surprise. The greenhouse interior stayed at 55 degrees. The cabin, with a small fire, stayed at 70. Sarah's daughter Emma ran outside the next morning, her breath steaming in the cold air, and threw her arms around Elias's waist. "It works," she said. "It really works. It really does." Word of the success spread beyond Harlan Creek. Settlers from neighboring valleys rode in to see the glass structures, to ask questions, to request help building their own. A newspaper reporter from Helena arrived in May, spent 3 days interviewing Elias and measuring temperatures, and published a story that ran on the front page. "The Glass Man of Montana," the headline read. "Scientific farmer proves doubters wrong with revolutionary heating system," Professor Jameson wrote again. The article had attracted attention from the scientific community. A professor from the University of Chicago wanted to visit. A delegation from the territorial government was interested in promoting the design to new settlers. A businessman in San Francisco had inquired about licensing the technique for commercial greenhouses. Elias read the letters with a mixture of pride and unease. He had wanted to prove a principle, to honor Catherine's memory, to demonstrate that knowledge could triumph over ignorance. He had not anticipated becoming famous, but fame brought resources. The businessman from San Francisco sent a bank draft for $500 as a preliminary investment, requesting only that Elias keep him informed of future developments. Professor Jameson arranged for a shipment of superior German glass at wholesale prices. The territorial government offered a land grant, an additional 160 acres adjacent to Elias's existing claim, in exchange for his agreement to teach greenhouse construction to settlers throughout the territory. By midsummer, Elias had more money than he had ever possessed. He used it to expand operations. He hired carpenters, trained them in greenhouse construction, and dispatched them to help families throughout the region. He established a supply depot in Harlan Creek, stocking glass panes, framing lumber, and sealant materials. He wrote a detailed construction manual, 40 pages of specifications and diagrams, and had it printed in Helena for distribution. Marcus Aldridge transformed his store into a greenhouse supply center. The man who had once mocked Elias now promoted his designs to every customer, offering credit terms to families who couldn't afford the full cost up front. "I owe a debt," Marcus told anyone who asked about his change of heart. "I can never fully repay it, but I can try." Tom worked alongside Elias as a full partner. The young man had a natural gift for explaining technical concepts, translating Elias's precise language into terms that ordinary settlers could understand and apply. Together they refined the design, developing simplified versions that could be built, with local materials, reducing costs without sacrificing effectiveness. By autumn of 1878, 37 greenhouses stood in the valley surrounding Harlan Creek. Each one represented a family that would survive the coming winter without desperation, without burning furniture, without watching children shiver through endless nights. Elias should have been satisfied. He had achieved everything he had hoped for, and more. The principle was proven. The knowledge was spreading. Catherine's belief in the power of understanding had been vindicated beyond any reasonable doubt, but satisfaction eluded him. Something was coming. He could feel it the way a man feels a storm before the clouds appear, a pressure in the air, a wrongness that had no name. The wrongness arrived in October, wearing a black suit and carrying a leather satchel full of documents. His name was Franklin Pierce Holloway, and he represented the Northern Pacific Railroad. "Mr. Thorne," Holloway said, settling into the chair across from Elias without waiting for an invitation, "I've come to discuss your future. My future is my own concern. I'm afraid that's no longer true." Holloway opened his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Are you aware that the Northern Pacific holds a federal land grant encompassing all odd-numbered sections within 40 miles of our proposed route through Montana territory?" Elias felt the first chill of understanding. "I filed my claim under the Homestead Act. I've met all requirements for proving up." "Indeed you have. Unfortunately, your claim falls within Section 17, Township 4 North, Range 8 West, an odd-numbered section." Holloway smiled without warmth. "Which means your land belongs to the Northern Pacific Railroad. Your homestead filing was processed in error by an incompetent clerk who failed to check the railroad grant maps." "That's impossible. The land office confirmed my claim." "The land office made a mistake. Mistakes can be corrected." Holloway laid a document on the table. "This is a notice of eviction. You have 60 days to vacate the premises. All structures, including your rather famous greenhouse, become property of the Northern Pacific upon your departure." Elias stared at the paper. The words blurred before his eyes. "You can't do this. I've invested 3 years of my life in this claim. I've built something that's helping hundreds of families survive." "I'm aware of your accomplishments. That's precisely why I'm here." Holloway's smile widened. "The Northern Pacific has significant interests in Montana's development. We're building a rail line that will transform this territory. We need stations, depots, support facilities, and we need housing for our workers, housing that can withstand Montana winters without bankrupting us in fuel costs. You want my greenhouse design? We want everything. The land, the structures, the designs, the expertise. We're prepared to offer you a position with the company, a salary of $2,000 per year, plus a percentage of any construction contracts that utilize your methods." Elias thought of the 37 families who had built greenhouses on his guidance. He thought of the supply depot, the trained carpenters, the network of mutual support that had grown from his single cabin. "And if I refuse?" "Then you vacate in 60 days. Your structures are demolished to make way for a rail depot, and your designs become public domain. We build our own greenhouses without paying you a cent, and you have nothing." Holloway gathered his papers. "The choice seems clear to me, but I'll give you time to consider. I'll return in 1 week for your answer." He left without waiting for a response. Tom found Elias sitting motionless at the table an hour later, the eviction notice still in his hands. "What happened? You look like someone died." Elias told him everything. Tom's face went pale, then red with anger. "They can't do this. It's not right." "Right has nothing to do with it. They have the law on their side." "Then we fight the law. We appeal. We petition. We go to the newspapers. You're famous now. People know your name. They won't let the railroad steal your land." "The railroad owns the newspapers. The railroad owns the politicians. The railroad owns everything in this territory except the people, and they're working on that." Elias set down the notice. "I've seen this before. In Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Kansas. The railroads take what they want. Men like me either bend or break." "So you're going to give up after everything you've built?" Elias looked at the young man who had become like a son to him. He saw the fire in Tom's eyes, the refusal to accept defeat, the stubborn belief that justice could prevail against power. He had felt that fire once. He had lost it somewhere along the way, ground down by repeated defeats, by the death of his wife, by the endless exhaustion of swimming against the current. But Tom still burned, and perhaps that flame was contagious. "No," Elias said slowly. "I'm not going to give up. I'm going to fight. But I need to fight smart, not hard. Power can't be defeated by direct opposition. It has to be outmaneuvered." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I have a week to figure it out." The week became a blur of letters, conversations, and desperate planning. Elias wrote to Professor Jameson explaining the situation and asking for advice. He wrote to the businessman in San Francisco who had connections in Washington. He wrote to the territorial governor, to members of Congress, to anyone he could think of who might have influence over the Northern Pacific. The responses came slowly, and most were discouraging. The railroad land grants were sacred, written into federal law, protected by armies of lawyers and mountains of money. Fighting them in court was suicide. Fighting them in Congress was impossible. But one letter offered a glimmer of hope. It came from a man named Cornelius Whitfield, the Harvard professor who had calculated the theoretical limits of greenhouse heating. Whitfield had connections in the scientific community, connections that extended into surprising places. The Smithsonian Institution, Whitfield wrote, has recently begun a program to document and preserve examples of American agricultural innovation. They have the power to designate sites of scientific importance, which carries certain legal protections against development or destruction. If your greenhouse could be classified as a site of national scientific significance, the railroad might find itself unable to demolish it regardless of their land claims. Elias read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote back immediately, asking for more information and requesting any assistance Whitfield could provide. The response came 4 days later, on the morning of Holloway's return. Whitfield was coming to Montana. He was bringing a delegation from the Smithsonian, including a photographer, a surveyor, and a representative of the Department of Agriculture. They would arrive in 3 weeks to evaluate the greenhouse for potential designation. 3 weeks. But Holloway's deadline was today. Elias met the railroad man at the door of the greenhouse, the letters in his hand. "Mr. Holloway, I have something to show you." Holloway read the correspondence with growing irritation. "This changes nothing. Smithsonian designation or not, the land belongs to the Northern Pacific. We can work around a preserved building." "Can you?" "Read the second letter more carefully. The designation extends to the entire parcel necessary for the scientific significance to be maintained. That includes the southern exposure, the drainage system, the surrounding terrain. The Smithsonian would effectively control my entire claim." "That's ridiculous. The federal government can't simply seize railroad land." "The Smithsonian is a federal institution with congressional charter. Their preservation authority supersedes private land claims, including railroad grants. It's the same principle that protects military installations and federal facilities from state interference." Elias smiled. "I didn't know that until Professor Whitfield explained it. But he's been dealing with railroad lawyers for 20 years. He knows their weaknesses." Holloway's face had gone red. "This is a delaying tactic. You can't hold off the Northern Pacific forever." "I don't need to hold you off forever. I just need to hold you off long enough for the designation to become official. And once it's official, your eviction notice becomes worthless. The railroad will fight this in court." "I hope they do. A court battle over scientific preservation versus railroad development would generate enormous publicity. The newspapers you own would have to cover it. The politicians you own would have to take positions. And every settler in Montana who's built a greenhouse based on my designs would know exactly who was trying to destroy the man who helped them survive." Holloway stood motionless, calculating. Elias watched the emotions play across his face: anger, frustration, grudging respect. You've outmaneuvered us. I've bought time. Whether I win depends on what happens in the next 3 weeks. The railroad doesn't forget, Mr. Thorne. We don't forgive. This isn't over. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Holloway left without another word. Elias watched him ride away, then sat down heavily on the bench outside the greenhouse door. Tom emerged from behind the cabin where he had been listening. You did it. You beat them. I delayed them. The real fight is just beginning. The Smithsonian delegation arrived on November 2nd, 1878. Professor Whitfield led the group, a silver-haired man with a scholar's stoop and a politician's handshake. With him came a photographer named Charles Morrison, a surveyor named James Polk, and a young man from the Department of Agriculture named Theodore Marsh. They spent 3 days examining the greenhouse, measuring temperatures, photographing construction details, and interviewing Elias about his methods. They visited the Brennan greenhouse, the supply depot, and 3 other installations in neighboring valleys. They talked to settlers, recorded testimonies, and compiled data. On the evening of the 3rd day, Whitfield asked Elias to join him for a walk along the ridge above the claim. You understand what's at stake here, Whitfield said. The railroad isn't going to accept this quietly. They have lawyers, they have money, they have political influence. If we designate this site, they'll fight us in every arena available. I understand. And you understand that the Smithsonian's protection isn't absolute. Congress can override our designations. Presidents can pressure us to reconsider. We're a federal institution, but we're not immune to federal politics. Professor, I've spent 3 years building something that helps people survive. I've watched families shelter in my greenhouse while their neighbors froze. I've seen children who would have died grow healthy and strong because of principles I learned from books. If the railroad wants to destroy that, they'll have to do it in public where everyone can see what they're doing. Whitfield nodded slowly. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. This is preliminary notification of designation. The full paperwork will take months to process, but this document establishes federal interest in your site effective immediately. It's not permanent protection, but it's enough to stop an eviction. Elias took the envelope with trembling hands. Thank you. I don't have words to express what this means. Don't thank me yet. The hard part is coming. The railroad will escalate. They'll try to discredit you, to question your methods, to prove that your greenhouse is a fraud. They'll bring their own scientists, their own experts, their own evidence. You'll have to defend not just your land, but your entire body of work. Then I'll defend it. Good. Whitfield clapped him on the shoulder. Because the winter you're about to face isn't the one outside your windows. It's the one in the halls of power, where men in suits fight battles with paper and ink, and that winter doesn't end in March. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was milder than its predecessor, but the political storms raged without pause. The Northern Pacific filed legal challenges, disputing the Smithsonian's authority, questioning the scientific validity of greenhouse heating, demanding congressional hearings on federal overreach. Newspapers across the territory ran stories attacking Elias. He was a charlatan, they claimed. His temperature readings were fabricated. His construction methods were dangerous. A greenhouse in Wyoming had collapsed under snow load, injuring 2 children, and the papers blamed Elias even though the structure had been built without following his specifications. Elias responded to each attack with data, publishing his complete records in scientific journals, inviting independent researchers to verify his measurements, documenting every greenhouse he had helped build and its performance through the winter. Tom organized the settlers into a defense committee, collecting testimonies from families who had survived thanks to the greenhouse designs. The congressional hearing came in February, convened by a senator from Minnesota who happened to own significant Northern Pacific stock. Elias traveled to Washington to testify, his first time east of the Mississippi since Catherine's death. The hearing room was paneled in dark wood, filled with men in expensive suits, thick with cigar smoke and political calculation. Elias sat at a table facing a raised platform where the senators presided like judges at a trial. The railroad's lawyers went first. They presented their case with polished precision, citing legal precedents, questioning federal authority, painting Elias as a self-promoting fraud who had manipulated the Smithsonian into protecting his worthless claim. Then Elias spoke. He didn't argue law. He didn't debate politics. He simply told the truth. He described the winter of 1877 to 1878. He described the families who had burned their furniture, their barns, their hope. He described the children who had shivered through endless nights, the men who had died cutting firewood in blizzards, the women who had watched their husbands and fathers carried home frozen. He described what the greenhouse had done, not in theory but in practice. Temperatures measured, fuel saved, lives preserved. He produced the letters from grateful families, the scientific papers documenting his methods, the photographs of structures standing strong against Montana winds. And then he asked a simple question. If the Northern Pacific takes my land and destroys my greenhouse, what happens to the families who depend on this knowledge? What happens to the settlers who built their homes based on principles I taught them? What happens to the children who survived last winter because of glass walls and captured sunlight? The room was silent. The railroad wants my land because it's valuable, but it's valuable because of what I built on it, what I discovered there, what I shared with my neighbors. If you let them take it, you're not just taking land from one man. You're taking hope from an entire territory. The hearing ended without a verdict. The senators retreated to private chambers to debate, negotiate, and calculate political advantage. Elias returned to Montana to wait. The waiting lasted until April. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a special courier who had ridden 3 days from Helena. Elias opened it with Tom and Marcus standing beside him, their faces taut with tension. The Smithsonian designation was confirmed. The railroad's legal challenges were dismissed. The senator from Minnesota had withdrawn his opposition after receiving 600 letters from Montana settlers, organized by Tom's defense committee, threatening to vote against any politician who supported the Northern Pacific's claim. Elias read the words 3 times before they became real. "It's over," he said. "We won." Tom whooped and grabbed him in a bear hug. Marcus stood back, his eyes wet, nodding slowly. "Catherine would be proud," Marcus said. "I never met her, but I know she would be proud." Elias thought of his wife, of her belief in knowledge, of her faith that understanding could triumph over ignorance. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the years of wandering, the mockery and rejection, the winter nights when the glass walls had glowed with captured light. She would be, he agreed. She would be. Spring came to Harlan Creek with its usual riot of color and bird song. Elias walked through the valley where 37 greenhouses now stood, each one a testament to principles discovered in distant libraries and proven in Montana snow. Children played in yards that stayed warm through the worst blizzards. Families planned gardens in soil that would produce food year-round, sheltered from frost by glass walls and captured sunshine. Tom had taken over most of the teaching duties, traveling throughout the territory to help settlers build their own structures. He had become known as the greenhouse architect, a title he wore with quiet pride. His relationship with Marcus had healed slowly, rebuilt through shared work and mutual respect. Marcus himself had changed beyond recognition. The hard man who had mocked Elias on his store porch was gone, replaced by someone humbler, Kinder, more willing to admit ignorance and learn from others. He had funded the construction of a public greenhouse in Harlan Creek, a community structure where anyone could grow food through the winter months. Above its door hung a sign that read, "The Catherine Thorne Memorial Garden." Elias stood before that sign on a warm May morning, feeling the sun on his face, listening to the sounds of a town that had survived and grown. "She saved us all," Tom said, coming to stand beside him, "even though she never saw this place. She taught me how to think. Everything else followed from that." "What will you do now? The designation is permanent. Your land is protected. You could rest." Elias considered the question. He thought about the letters still arriving from settlers across the West, asking for guidance. He thought about the universities requesting his methods, the government seeking his advice, the countless families who could benefit from knowledge he possessed. "Rest is for the dead," he said. Catherine believed that understanding was the greatest gift a person could possess. I believed her. Now I have to prove her right, not just here, but everywhere the cold still kills. That's a lot of greenhouses. Then I'd better get started. He turned from the memorial garden and walked toward his greenhouse, where the glass walls caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the spring flowers. Behind him, the town of Harlan Creek hummed with the sounds of life, of families who had survived the worst winter in memory, of children who would grow up warm. The glass fool had won, but the real victory belonged to everyone who had learned that knowledge was stronger than fear, that understanding could triumph over tradition, and that sometimes the crazy man with books knew something the world needed to hear. The neighbors had laughed when he built a greenhouse around his cabin. They had called him a fool, a madman, a dreamer disconnected from reality. But his firewood had lasted all winter, and in the end, that was the only argument that mattered.